Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 2nd of November. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 252 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The Kremlin has said that it will rejoin the UN-administered grain export corridor from Ukraine after pulling out over the weekend after a drone attack on Russian warships in the port of Sevastopol. Moscow's humiliating climb-down came 2 days after a large convoy of ships moved a record amount of grain in defiance of Russia's warnings that it would be unsafe without its participation. Moscow has said it would summon the UK ambassador, Deborah Brunnert, over its unfounded accusation that British specialists were involved in the Sevastopol attack. The governor of the Kyiv region, Alexei Kuleba, has said that due to Russian attacks, 16,000 homes in the region remain without electricity. Mr. Kuleba warned that the attacks could disrupt the heating supply, which also relies on electricity. He said there are 750 points in the Kyiv region to which residents can go to get warm, be fed, and to access water. Olesun Yehubov, the governor of the Kharkiv region that borders Luhansk and Donetsk in Ukraine's east, said 5 people were injured this morning in the city of Vovchansk following Russian shelling. Russian security services in Crimea claim to have foiled a plot to sabotage energy supplies in the region by Ukraine's security services and have detained a man in connection with it. Russia has said it is fully committed to preventing nuclear war and that avoiding a clash among countries that have nuclear weapons is its highest priority. Poland will build a razor wire fence on its border with Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, its defence minister said earlier today. Spain's foreign minister, José Manuel Albares, visited Kyiv earlier today, where he met with his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmitry Kuleba. As part of its latest aid package, Spain is donating 30 ambulances to Ukraine. 2 Russian oligarchs and business partners of Roman Abramovich have been added to the UK government's sanctions list in response to the invasion of Ukraine. The US has information that indicates North Korea is secretly supplying Russia with artillery shells, according to the White House spokesperson John Kirby. And the Russian occupying government in the Kherson Oblast has moved its administration further south to Skadovsk, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has said. Now, we're lucky to be joined this evening by Serena Cowdy. Serena is a councillor on Angus Council representing Arbroath West. She has worked as a consumer rights and personal finance journalist for various publications and also covered political issues for The House, which is the in-house magazine of the Houses of Parliament, for Huffington Post, and for Politics Home. Serena, good evening. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7. Our first item this evening is that measures announced today will provide further help to those most impacted by the cost of living crisis while tackling budget pressures caused by rising inflation and economic uncertainty. The Emergency Budget Review for 2022-23 identifies funding of around £35 million for a range of incentives to support people with the increased cost of living, including doubling the Fuel Insecurity Fund, doubling the Scottish Child Bridging Payment to £260, and a new £1.4 million Island Cost Crisis Emergency Fund to help island households manage higher energy costs. Significant investment in public sector pay deals, delivering higher increases in pay for low earners, is also designed to help families and individuals deal with the cost of living crisis. Other measures include confirming funds to local authorities to support discretionary housing payments, establishing a joint task force with business, Cllr, local authorities and agencies to consider the differing impacts of regulation on business, extending energy advice to businesses by investing £300,000 to expand the services of Business Energy Scotland, while doubling the value of the SME Energy Efficiency Loan and Cashback Scheme for energy efficiency to £20,000. New payment break options to help protect those who have agreed to repay debt through the debt arrangement scheme but face unexpected increases in the cost of living. Additional savings of £615 million have been identified to enable enhanced public sector pay offers to be made while maintaining a route to complying with ministers' responsibility to balance the budget. They follow savings of £560 million already announced on the 7th of September. So, Serena, the Deputy First Minister said, as a result of inflation, the Scottish Government's budget today is worth £1.7 billion less than when it was published last December. At the same time, demand for government support and intervention is understandably increasing, while we continue to try to fund increased public sector pay claims, particularly for those on the lowest incomes. Initially, the Scottish Government was told we would receive an additional £660 million through the block grant adjustment. Now, with the new Chancellor scrapping the plan to cut the basic rate of income tax in the rest of the UK, our funding will be reduced by £230 million over the period of the spending review. This represents a swing of almost £900 million in the space of less than a month. So how can any of the devolved governments, Holyrood, Belfast or Cardiff, be expected to operate with such incredible unplanned swings in their funding?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think this is a situation where we need to try and break down where the crisis is coming from. So there's absolutely issues that are affecting countries all around the world, which would be the pandemic and it would be the war in Ukraine. But now in the UK, we have a very unique set of circumstances that's created this sort of perfect storm, because obviously the elephant in the room that the Conservative government don't want to talk about, and actually Labour don't particularly want to talk about by the sound of it, is Brexit. So we've got that on top of all the problems that the whole world is facing just now. And in that context, the way I would put it is the Scottish Government has been handed this very unique perfect storm, half of which we did not create. And so we're trying to deal with it and fight back as best we can. But as you said, we've got one hand tied behind our back because we don't have the borrowing powers that we would need to dig ourselves out and increase our borrowing to help these situations and resolve them. And we also, for example, we don't have the powers to increase income tax mid financial year. So I to your point, it's horrific, and I'm all for politicians taking responsibility for their mistakes. And what I've noticed recently is when we talk in the SNP, the way I'm talking now, the opposition parties make great play of focusing on the devolved areas of government and maybe what we could have done better. And I would say actually politicians from all political parties, generally speaking, are a bit too reluctant to publicly state when they have made a mistake. But I won't take lessons on those areas when really what the opposition parties are trying to do is deflect from the biggest problem we've got right now as a unique UK problem economically, which is Brexit.
Thanks, Serena. Well, we will be touching on Brexit a few times this evening, I think. But to the points that you were making, John Swinney also said the Scottish Government budget is largely fixed. We have no ability to borrow to increase our spending day to day. Our reserve funding is fully utilised, and our income tax powers prevent us or do not allow changes to be made during the financial year. So, as part of the evolution of the current devolved settlement, should the Scottish Government be granted the power to borrow as a matter of in emergency circumstances, and should moves be made to allow taxes in Scotland to be varied more than once annually?
Well, my instinct says yes. I think my instinct also says this is not the full solution to the problem. We've seen when the unionists try to give us a little bit more and a little bit more. It's welcome when that little bit more comes in our direction. And I think that the powers you describe would be sensible, especially in the current circumstances. But ultimately, some of the most vulnerable in society in my constituency, in my ward, they're facing problems because of things we don't have control over. For example, social security, a lot of aspects of social security. So, for example, we also need to see the UK government uplifting benefits, in line with inflation, and doing the same for pensions. So it's not, unfortunately, just as simple as giving us the borrowing powers we need.
Of course, of course. And the one other thing that John Swinney said this afternoon was that I must balance the books, but I am committed to doing so in a way that prioritises funding to help families, to back business, to provide fair pay awards, and to protect the delivery of public services. So, should the, in the same way as the what we were just discussing in connection with changing taxes during the year and borrowing powers, should the prohibition against Scotland being able to run a budget deficit, as just about every other country in the world does, should that prohibition be lifted now in order to allow the Scottish Government to respond to these multiple crises that at the moment they are not within the Scottish Government's control?
So I think the nearer we can get to being what I would say a normal independent country economically, the better. So as you say, normal independent countries all around the world, that's the position they are in, and I would say that in these quite unprecedented times, that's exactly the sort of measure that should be considered. I think it's absolutely right for John Swinney to focus, and the Scottish Government to be focused on prioritising the most vulnerable in society at this point, and also honouring, decent pay awards to public sector workers, and absolutely essential, providing, the best possible welcome we can for Ukrainian guests. So all these things we should be focusing on. It's just that, as I say, we've got one and a half hands tied behind our back at the minute when we're trying to do it.
Absolutely, I get the point. And one final thing on this aspect this afternoon, it struck me that unlike the missing Office for Budget Responsibility impact assessment on the last Tory budget, the Scottish Government managed to include a report from the expert panel of economists, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, Professor Francis Ruane, and Dr. Mike Brewer. The Scottish Government managed to publish that at the same time as the review this afternoon. So if the Scottish Government can publish expert analysis of its tax and spending plans, what's inhibiting Westminster from doing the same thing?
Well, I can't speak for Westminster, but I think we've seen in the last month that expert analysis of economic matters has been sadly lacking, at least publicly, when it comes to the Westminster government's economic strategy. So we've seen a lot in recent years, of people saying, "Oh, we've heard too much from experts." I've seen several Conservative ministers express that sentiment in one way or another. I think that has put us in a very difficult position. Let's put it that way. I think we need to hear more from experts, and less from people who make up policy on the hoof, because it fits with their ideological dream.
Thanks, Serena. Yes, and we will be talking about ideological dreams and economic policy a little bit later on this evening. But we'll move on to our next item just now, because UK food price inflation soared to a record annual rate of 11.6% in October, as staples such as tea bags, milk and sugar became more expensive, along with fresh food, data shows. Annual food inflation rose from 10.6% in September, the latest monthly report from the British Retail Consortium and the data firm Nielsen has shown. The annual price increase of fresh food last month was particularly high, up 13.3% year on year, compared with 12.1% in September. Non-food inflation picked up to 4.1% from 3.3% the month before, meaning overall shop prices were 6.6% higher year on year, also a record rise for the index. The British Retail Consortium Chief Executive Helen Dickinson said it has been a difficult month for consumers who not only faced an increase in their energy bills, but also a more expensive shopping basket. Prices were pushed up because of the significant input cost pressures faced by retailers due to rising commodity and energy prices and a tight labour market. Even the price of basic items went up, with the price of the humble cuppa rising as tea bags, milk and sugar all saw significant rises. While some supply chain costs are beginning to fall, this is more than offset by the cost of energy, meaning a difficult time ahead for retailers and households alike. So Helen Dickinson said that the prices were pushed up because of significant input cost pressures due to rising commodity and energy prices and a tight labour market. Is a tight labour market, is that the sound of someone beginning to blame Brexit for at least part of the current calamity?
Well, I think, as I said at the beginning of the program, it would be irresponsible to be too simplistic because, as I sort of outlined, there's all these factors that have come together. I think Brexit is, in my opinion, 100% a factor in these labour market issues. You can see how it's affected the food supply issues where I represent in Arbroath West, Letham and Freakham, my ward, and why more widely in Angus the shortages of people in the food growing areas in the farms and the workers that used to come from the EU. That's apparent. We can all see that as a problem. And I've got no doubt that that is also a factor in the chain later on in the food supply industry. There's no doubt about it, in my opinion.
Thanks, Serena. As you say, I think we've seen a number of examples of soft fruit businesses across Tayside and Angus either not harvesting at all this year, or harvesting a very, very much reduced amount of their fantastic produce. But thinking of food again for a moment, Richard Walker, who's the MD of Iceland, the food company, has also warned of growing food insecurity. He told the BBC this morning, food insecurity is inevitably on the rise, and it's the household with kids who are most at risk. Now, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it? Health, education, and crime are all going to be made worse by food insecurity.
Yep, absolutely. And I see that in several different ways. So there'll be offers and there'll be deals in the supermarkets, and that is to be welcomed. And I would say that I would strongly urge the supermarkets to target any lost leaders or any really good offers at the people who need them most. Please, the supermarkets, I would urge them to put their budget ranges front and center of this sort of thing, because it'll be the people with families and young kids who don't have the time. They're rushed, they're maybe running two jobs, they don't have the time or the energy to be rooting around for the best deals under the more expensive products. So I think that's the sort of thing that really the onus should be on the supermarkets, to help people as much as possible in that respect. The other thing I would say is that there's a huge reliance, and there has been for years now in some communities and some demographics, on food banks. I think it's shameful that in the 21st century in the UK, food banks have needed to fill such a gap. Obviously, do an amazing job. The other kind of arm of the area that I'm talking about is social supermarkets. We have an excellent social supermarket in Angus. So you can go and you can shop and you can have an enjoyable shopping experience, and it's very dignified and there's no stigma to it. They do charge, but they have much reduced prices for the food. So I think that's a lovely option for people. But actually, what's interesting is that I'm seeing not only in Angus, but across the UK, social supermarkets are saying they are struggling with their supply, because the supermarkets and the suppliers who would normally supply them with food, that suppliers is dropping off. So they're having to look for more imaginative ways of having stock ready for people to buy. So it's permeating through all levels of the process.
Absolutely. Thank you, Serena. Now, we'll move on to our next item now, because the SNP has warned that Rishi Sunak's Austerity 2.0 plan to make taxpayers foot the bill for the Tory economic crisis will take a wrecking ball to public services. The SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford MP, warned that millions of families are paying the price for Tory incompetence on the economy amid reports the Tory government is planning to raise taxes, slash public services, and impose real-term cuts to public sector pay in order to fill the black hole it created. In a motion in the House of Commons, Mr Blackford called for benefits and pensions to be increased in line with inflation. Commenting, he said, "Millions of families are paying the price for Tory incompetence on the economy. The disastrous Tory mini-budget has cost families dearly, and Brexit has set the UK on a path of long-term decline." Rishi Sunak's plans to impose Austerity 2.0 will take a wrecking ball to public services and squeeze household incomes even further at the worst possible time. With the Tories and Labour both intent on trashing the economy with Brexit, costing Scotland billions of pounds, there is no route to safety shackled to the failing UK state. The only way to get Scotland's economy on the right track is with independence in Europe. So, Serena, George Osborne's austerity 1.0 didn't work when he embarked on it 12 years ago. It's one of the reasons we are where we are. So, why would it work this time around? Or is it, as you were saying earlier on, is it simply dogma above everything else?
Well, no, obviously it didn't. One of the things it did was to increase inequality in society, and then as a result of that, food banks have become a much more prominent feature, as I mentioned. Um, the problem is that if we are not free to act on our own, people say, "Well, Boris has gone now. Maybe things will be better." You know, your case for independence has been weakened by the fact that Boris is no longer around. But unfortunately, we've just in the last couple of months we've seen how wrong that is. Ideologically, the party that is likely to be in control of the UK, you know, at least half the time, is completely not prioritising the most vulnerable in society. The Conservatives have shown that. They did their really extreme economic experiment based on, what Kwasi Kwarteng wanted to sort of test out. And I think that's unbelievably irresponsible. And now, yes, they've reversed some of those measures, but only because they realised that it wouldn't wash with the Conservative MPs, and they were worried about their seats. That's not a reason um, to make a change. A reason to make a change is you realise that you're doing the wrong thing for the most vulnerable in society, and I don't think that realisation has been had. I mean, Rishi Sunak, I really hope he takes a more economically responsible course. But this is what happens when you turn around and find most of the remaining members of the Conservative Party in Parliament are not the decent ones. Let's put it that way.
That's very delicately described. Thank you, Serena. Let's move on now. We will come back to some of the points you were making, but let's talk about another item that's making the headlines because hundreds of refugees have been moved out of an immigration centre in Kent amid concerns it had become dangerously overcrowded. The new Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick MP, said the number of people at the Manston Immigration Processing Centre had fallen substantially by yesterday, with more expected to be moved today. It came after the situation was labelled a breach of humane conditions on Monday, with 4,000 people being held at the site. The exact number to have been relocated has not been confirmed, but Sir Roger Gale, the Conservative MP for the North Thanet constituency that includes Manston, said that several hundred had already been moved. The union representing Border Force staff working at the site said on Tuesday that the Home Office hoped to take 400 people out of the site. Two coaches with tinted windows were seen leaving the centre at about 4:15 p.m. yesterday. It appeared the buses were full of people. Another coach entered the site at about 4:25 p.m. It is unclear whether those moved from Manston will be taken to hotels or to alternative accommodation. So, Serena, firstly, a Home Office source today says that delays mean thousands of people will be able to make compensation claims against the government, since Suella Braverman has clearly broken the law, as Manston is a site for processing, not detention. So, is this setting up another confrontation between Braverman and lawyers seeking compensation arising from her breaking the law? And more broadly, perhaps, is this an indication that this mess is precisely what she and Priti Patel intended in order to further their culture wars?
There's no doubt that the actions and the rhetoric of first Priti Patel and now Suella Braverman are deeply unhelpful. I would say that much of the language that's being used is very offensive. We all know what Suella Braverman said about it being her dream and obsession to send migrants off to Rwanda before Christmas. And all of these things have contributed to what is an extremely toxic environment for everybody involved. I would I would say that rhetoric has consequences, and we don't know why the man that firebombed the immigration centre did so, but we do have evidence that he was posting anti-Muslim content and he was very angry with migrants for various reasons. And I think the tone of the debate up until now has created a very toxic and traumatic environment for those who are coming to our shores. I wouldn't want to comment on whether it's been a deliberate strategy. I'm not sure that, apart from anything else, I'm not sure that either of those Home Secretaries had that much foresight in any area. But it's definitely, this has been a long time coming. This problem, in my opinion, is a result of. I'd comment on what the British Red Cross said rather than, as I say, go to what the experts are saying. And they're saying there's a deep-seated issue with the immigration system and the way people are processed. And they're saying one of the things that needs to happen is this backlog needs to have been cleared much more quickly by allowing certain people's applications to be processed more quickly. And they're saying that there needs to be more safe routes to come to this country, to come to the UK. So they're saying that, and I, as I say, I refer to the experts.
Thanks, Serena. One other aspect of this story that struck me this afternoon is that Lieutenant General Stuart Skeets, a former commander of Sandhurst Military College, has been tasked by the Home Office to manage the various agencies and contractors working on the site at Manston. Now, I think that's the first time the military have been in charge of civilian detention in the UK since internment during the Civil War on the island of Ireland, a thing called Operation Demetrius, in August 1971. Now, internment by the military at that time proved to be an unmitigated and total disaster. Is that what's going to happen this time around again?
I feel like this is an extremely depressing scenario because it's completely the opposite of what should be happening, which is that people are integrated into communities as quickly as possible. Generally, the military angle is something that I would like to see minimized as much as possible. I don't for 1 minute think that any particular military involvement is in their mind sinister or anything other than just doing their jobs, but it's definitely not a formula that works when it comes to people's long-term well-being.
Thank you, Serena. Let's move on to the next item this evening, because Rishi Sunak is now to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next week, after Number 10 previously said he was too focused on domestic economy to attend, and also banned King Charles from going. Sunak announced the U-turn on Twitter, making no reference to his previous reluctance, saying, "There is no long-term prosperity without action on climate change. There is no energy security without investing in renewables. This is why I will attend COP27 next week, to deliver on Glasgow's legacy of building a secure and sustainable future." The move may open the door for King Charles to attend as well, just 5 days after Number 10 had said that it was not the right occasion for him to do so. Sunak had come under sustained pressure to go to COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh from many supporters of the UK's net zero goals in the Conservative Party and Parliament more broadly, as well as facing international criticism. Deirdre Brock MP said, "This is a welcome U-turn from Rishi Sunak, his third in just 8 days, after a monumental error. The Tories' failure to properly invest in renewable energy has contributed to the UK's soaring energy bill crisis and winter blackout threats." She continued, "That is why Scotland needs independence, so we can finally unleash our renewable energy potential and rid ourselves of this outdated, dysfunctional Westminster system for good." Now, Serena, there's been some discussion of the fact that Sunak is not a long-experienced MP, let alone a minister. And added to that, senior civil servants at the Treasury and the Home Office have been sacked or forced out recently. Already, Sunak has already dropped plans to fine patients £10 for missing GP appointments and to scrap or reform all EU legislation before the next election. He's also backed down on fracking. There are reports this afternoon that more U-turns are about to be made. During his leadership campaign, he promised ending the use of hotels to house asylum seekers, and he promised to set a target that 80% of asylum claims would be resolved within 6 months of being lodged. And these two additional items are now set to be abandoned. So, in a broader sense, is it incompetence or is it inexperience which is driving this Tory government to make so many unforced errors and perform so many U-turns, Or is there something else going on here?
So I think what I find really sad is I don't think it's so much either incompetence or any kind of doing it for any good reasons. What I think what's happening is that when you see the ministers or cabinet ministers, or in this case Rishi Sunak, make a U-turn on something, very often what you find is another conservative behind them, creating a kind of posturing, which means he has to jump. So in this case, it's just suspicious to me that Boris Johnson said he was going to attend COP27, and all of a sudden Rishi Sunak was changing his mind and U-turning and saying that no, he was going to attend. And the climate crisis is so much more important and deserves so much more respect than decisions being made about it, because two Tories have got handbags at dawn and are both trying to get in the spotlight. And you can see that with a lot of the other U-turns as well. As I say, the U-turns on the mini budget were really prompted by other Conservatives looking at their voting base and worrying they weren't going to get re-elected. So I just think it's a horribly serious situation we're all in right now. But what we see is that U-turns, as I say, in the current Tory party are really mostly prompted by other factions in the Tory party.
Thanks, Serena. And coming back to the another aspect of this story, I think that as at this moment in time, there are currently 15 Commonwealth realms, countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, St. Lucia, the Solomon Islands, and of course the United Kingdom, which all have King Charles as their head of state. So why would Number 10 think it could or should prevent the head of state of Australia or New Zealand or the Solomon Islands from attending COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh? According to the International Institute for Environment and Development, people from the Solomon Islands are experiencing profound loss and damage from climate change every day. The climate change is destroying the mangroves, the delicate ecosystems they support, and the biodiversity that flourishes there. Mangrove mud clams, which are a common source of protein which the people of the Solomon Islands rely on heavily, are disappearing, are dying out as rising seas overwhelm the shores and devastate the mangroves. Areas that once yielded plentiful harvests are now barren. If I was a Solomon Islander, I'd want my head of state at COP27, wouldn't you?
It's an interesting one because I've got absolutely no idea why they seem so reluctant to allow now King Charles to attend COP27. I've got my own views on the Commonwealth and I've got my own views on the monarchy. But given that they are apparently very enthusiastic about King Charles and all the grandeur, gravitas which they feel he brings, I would have thought and it would have been a clear and obvious thing to do. And to be fair to Charles, as I say, whatever I think about the monarchy, he has for many, many years, long before he was king, championed environmental causes before it was popular or cool to do so. So that makes it even more confusing to me.
It is very strange, Serena. I wonder if there's a to play the thing going on here with Downing Street trying to clip the wings of Buckingham Palace. But let's move on, because methane emissions in the UK could be cut by more than 40% by 2030 with a raft of inexpensive policies, according to Green Alliance, an environmental think tank. The government has pledged to cut emissions of methane, a greenhouse gas that has more than 80 times the global heating power of CO2, by at least 30% by 2030. The move was trumpeted by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, after the UK joined more than 100 countries to make the pledge at COP26 in Glasgow. But as yet, no specific proposals have been put forward by the UK government for how to make the cuts. The UK will hand over the COP presidency to Egypt before the COP27 summit, which starts on Sunday. But the lack of action by ministers risks the UK losing its reputation as a global leader in methane reductions, says the Green Alliance. In a report published today, it lists a series of low-cost measures which it says could reduce methane emissions from their 2020 levels by 43%. Key to the reductions are changes to the waste industry, the report says, By bringing forward the UK's ban on landfilling biodegradable waste to 2025 and mandating landfill operators to increase biogas capture, the UK could reduce methane emissions by 19% by 2030. A further 9% of methane savings could come from regulating the gas industry to end methane leaks, as urged by the International Energy Agency. Plugging these leaks would also rapidly increase gas supplies to the UK, supporting energy security. The report also urged the government to adopt measures to cut methane in agriculture and land use sectors, which makes up more than half of the total methane produced in the UK. By feeding dairy cows the methane-reducing supplement Bovaer 3 NOP, improving management of slurry, and encouraging the consumption of alternative proteins as well as fruit and vegetables, the UK could shave a further 15% off its methane emissions, the report said. So, Serena, managing landfill and cattle farming better sound pretty straightforward to me and simple things to do. So, why are we not doing them? Is it incompetence or malice in Westminster, or is it because we haven't had a functioning government for the last 6 months?
Yeah, so I think with regard to Boris Johnson trumpeting about it a year ago, I think we've heard quite a few things that Boris Johnson talked a lot about and not didn't do very much on. So it's a shame to see that no specific proposals have been put in place in the last year during our, ownership of COP. I think it was really interesting. I had a brief look at the report from the Green Alliance today, and it is fascinating how, in many ways, manageable and in some cases low cost these proposals are. The ones that make a really big difference. And I think probably when people think of methane, they might, if they know anything about it, think of cattle farming and probably thinking about cutting the world's meat production generally and actually moving completely away from cattle farming. But what was interesting in the report, as you highlighted, is that there are changes that can be made to what you feed dairy cows, and that massively reduce methane emissions. And similarly, with the processing of the biodegradable food waste, I've got a particular interest in this because I'm the environment spokesperson for the administration in Angus Council. So I've been in my first 6 months as a councillor looking more into this, and I had a trip to our council recycling centre, and it was really interesting to see the technologies that are being developed to be able to deal more effectively with all these different types of waste. So I think the will at local level is absolutely there. Our officers are really so knowledgeable about this and so interested in it. But if you don't have a push from right at the top, in this case, as I say, the UK government has not come up with any specific proposals since last year. It's disappointing.
Thanks, Serena. We'll look at climate warming from another perspective now, because temperatures in Europe have increased at more than twice the global average in the last 30 years, according to a report by the World Meteorological Organization. The effects of this warming are already being seen, with droughts, wildfires, and ice melts taking place across the continent. The European State of the Climate report, produced with the EU's Copernicus service, warns that as warming trend continues, exceptional heat, wildfires, floods, and other climate breakdown outcomes will affect society, economies, and ecosystems. From 1991 to 2021, temperatures in Europe have warmed at an average rate of about 0.5 degrees C every decade. This has had physical results. Alpine glaciers lost 30 metres in ice thickness, while the Greenland ice sheet has also been melting, contributing to sea level rise. In summer 2021, Greenland had its first ever recorded rainfall at its highest point, the summit station. Human life has been lost as a result of the extreme weather events. The report says that in 2021, high-impact weather and climate events, 84% of which were floods and storms, led to hundreds of fatalities, directly affected more than 500,000 people, and caused economic damage exceeding $50 billion US. It also found that this trend was very likely to continue, with more weather disasters predicted in the future. It predicts that temperatures will rise in all European areas at a rate exceeding global mean temperature changes, similar to past observations. As the climate warms to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, the weather events will accelerate, with ever-decreasing summer rainfall likely to cause devastating droughts. Extreme rain and flooding are likely to follow in the later months in all regions except the Mediterranean. Though the report makes for grim reading, there is some good news. It notes that many European countries have been very good at cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and EU emissions decreased 31% between 1990 and 2020. Europe has also acted to protect people from the worst effects of the climate emergency, with extreme weather warning systems protecting about 75% of people, while heat health action plans have saved many lives. So, Serena, the rate of warming is so grim in Europe. Is that now going to bring the climate crisis home to comparatively wealthy Europeans much more quickly and much more forcefully?
Well, isn't it sad that we need to be physically experiencing it ourselves before we take these things as seriously as we need to? There have been countries suffering from these consequences of climate change for at least several years, and we, as the West, I'll call us the West. We look and we feel sorry, and we might even send aid to the countries who are being affected, but we didn't act urgently enough, did we? And now it's coming to us, and we're beginning to wake up. Are we waking up fast enough? No, probably not. Still, I mean, I represent a coastal town. I've seen the modelling for what will happen to parts of the Angus coast by 2050, and that is, hopefully in my lifetime. It's not a case now of what will happen to our grandchildren's future, although that is obviously absolutely key. But people who are not young, who are not young kids, are now, I think, thinking that this is going to affect their homes and their businesses. Um, yeah, it's just sad that it's come to this before we've all woken up.
Absolutely, Serena. Thank you. Let's move on again now, because the parents of an Iranian woman who died 6 days after being shot while filming protests in her hometown have been subjected to a sustained harassment campaign by security forces, a relative and friend of the family has told The Guardian. Ghazali Chalabi, 33, was shot in the head in Amol on the 21st of September. A commemoration to mark the 40th day since her death, the end of the traditional mourning period in Iran, will be held on Thursday. Her death was particularly shocking because footage of the protests that she was making on her phone at the time she was shot were conserved and uploaded on social media. Her last words were, "Do not be afraid, do not be afraid." An aunt of Miss Chalabi said in an interview that her niece was in a coma before she died. She was shot from the front, the relative said. There was a small hole in her forehead. The bullet came out from behind her head so that the back of her head had a hole the size of a tangerine. The aunt said that while Ghazali was in a coma, her parents were repeatedly harassed by security forces who threatened to withhold the body and bury her in an unknown location if they made a noise. Security forces also threatened to take retaliatory action against Miss Chalabi's brother if the parents spoke out, and even rejected Chalabi's wish for her organs to be donated because it would make her seem a martyr, she said. These threats are typical of the intimidation tactics used by the security services to try to suppress the protests that have gripped the country for weeks since the death in police custody on the 16th of September by Mahsa Amini. The protests have posed one of the boldest challenges to Iran's clerical leaders in decades, gaining increasing traction and frustrating authorities who have tried to put the blame on Iran's foreign enemies and their agents for the unrest, a narrative that few Iranians believe. Security services have unleashed a fierce crackdown. At least 253 people have been killed, including 34 Iranians under 18, according to one human rights organisation, and several thousand people have been arrested, many taken to special detention centres run by the feared Revolutionary Guards. So, Serena, the threats are typical of the intimidation tactics used by Iranian security services. Uh, 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 since the death in police custody of Mahsa Amini. But these tactics are just going to make the situation worse, won't it? People in communities who are grieving for their daughters just won't stand for it.
Yeah, it's such an upsetting situation. I mean, I think in response to their fears that actions of others were going to make her a martyr, she, you know, we can all see the bravery and and what she has, the wave that she has affected, even though she has died, her actions there and then their reaction, as you say, it's made it so much worse for them. It's as if the authorities and men, and it usually is men at the top of that system, have completely misunderstood the reality of social media. And I've said this before, I criticize social media a lot, but these are the situations in which it really comes into its own, because they don't understand that there's nothing they can do to stop this information getting out. As you say, she was actually filming on her phone when she was shot. And so I think the light in the darkness here is that they are going to lose this information war, because they can't control the freedom with which this information can now be spread. That is obviously not going to be of any consolation to people who've lost their loved ones. But I think they're not, the authorities are not reacting intelligently. They're not reacting pragmatically. They can't handle this. They can't put it in a box. And I would just, of course, absolutely commend the bravery of everybody involved.
Absolutely, excuse me, absolutely, Serena, particularly brave in the circumstances. But let's move on to our final item now, because this afternoon there was an Opposition Day debate in Westminster. The motion was that this House regrets the economic damage the government has caused since the mini-budget on the 23rd of September 22, with the pound hitting a record low against the dollar, mortgage rates at their highest level since the financial crash, and inflation at a 40-year high. Calls on the government immediately to reinstate the bankers' bonus cap, increase benefits in line with inflation, and protect the pensions triple lock. Considers that Scotland cannot afford to be part of the failing state of the UK and must be independent for economic stability, and welcomes the publication of the Scottish Government's Independence Papers series. Now, following the debate, the motion that motion I've just read was passed by 30 votes in favour and no votes against. But here's a short clip of part of the debate this afternoon.
If the House will agree to them. And the first one I'm going to say is that Scotland would be a successful independent country. Yeah. Surely all of us could agree to that thing. Scotland would be a successful independent country. I'm not so sure about the Labour front bench, because I put that to the honourable gentleman and he wasn't so sure. But even the most rabid, passionate Tory unionists surely wouldn't try to assert that the Scottish people, with all their history of invention, with all our history of creation, of all our history of innovation, imagination, would somehow uniquely fail amongst all the peoples in the world who have secured independence. They would uniquely fail in making a success of our independence. So can we all agree Scotland would be a successful independent country? Yeah, of course we do.
I agree with the honourable gentleman. I'm delighted he's given away so early. This debate isn't about that. This debate is about the broken proposition that you are putting as a prospectus for that independent Scotland. And that's what we have demonstrated has holes in it. It's up to you to make that proposition, not us.
And I'll respond to that challenge and thank the honourable gentleman, because I think I heard him say that Scotland would be a successful independent country. I think that's what he was saying. So what I've got, okay, right, I want to hear the honourable gentleman say that too.
If you're looking for just that quote and to edit that out for video clip purposes, then I'm happy to oblige. But just as an independent Scotland or a separate Scotland could possibly succeed, would he also argue that an independent England or an independent Wales or an independent Northern Ireland would succeed as well, but not nearly as much as a United Kingdom?
Yes, this is progress, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I now feel I'm on the right sort of track with this, because I think what we're getting across the House is the agreement to the assertion that Scotland would be a successful independent country. I have no doubts whatsoever that England, without Scotland's contribution through its resources, would be equally successful as an independent nation. I believe that somehow they would just about muddle through without our support, intervention. And, I hope I'm going to get a clean sweep here now with the Liberals to agree to this, and I'm counting on the honourable gentleman to do that.
I hate to disappoint the honourable gentleman, but if you took a straw poll amongst the pregnant mothers in Caithness who now have to travel over 100 miles to to give birth to Inverness, and this has happened on the SNP's watch, he would get a pretty dusty answer.
You see, I was going so well, Mr Deputy Speaker. I had the Conservatives agree to that. I think I had the Labour Party agree to it. But the Liberals just could not bring themselves to agree with the proposition that an independent Scotland would be a successful independent nation. It's unfortunate. I think we've had the Liberals, if that's okay with Honourable Lady. I think we'll do all right. I'll come back to her, because I've got other assertions to make. Now, I think we've all agreed that, other than the Liberal Democrats. Let's try another one. With all our resources, and Mr Deputy Speaker, I refer, when I speak about all our resources, let's include the good proportion of nearly all of Europe's oil and gas reserves, the greatest potential for renewable energy that exists in Europe, vast fisheries, a water supply that is the envy in the world, that Scotland has what it takes to be an independent country. Could we all agree to that? Right.
There we are. That's a short clip of the debate from this afternoon in the House of Commons, the Opposition Day debate. So, Serena, we heard there from Pete Wishart. Are you encouraged, and is it really progress that unionist politicians are confirming that an independent Scotland would be successful?
Well, I think you can see there's a bit of flourish there from Pete Wishart, and I liked it a lot. I liked the way he framed that one, because one thing he is absolutely correct in is that there is such a combative style at Westminster almost all the time. The chamber is set up in that way. The culture is very much like that. No one can be seen to agree with anyone else from another party. And when that does change, and when there is that kind of consensus, however dragged out of them it was, that's good to see. It was interesting actually to see from the Liberal Democrat that he did exactly what I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, which is, when asked about the big picture, he chose instead to focus on a devolved area of government in Scotland, which he felt that the Scottish Government wasn't doing as well as it should have been in. It's deflection, and as I say, it bores me because it's lazy. It's lazy. Just answer the question.
Yes, answering questions is really very not the the order of the day for in Westminster at the moment. It seemed a slightly fractious debate with both Alistair Union Jack and Ian Murray both apologising at different stages for their unparliamentary language. And so, do you think, does this kind of debate in Westminster, no matter the language that's used, does this kind of debate mean very much to voters?
Well, interestingly, the coverage of Westminster that a lot of voters see is often particularly combative. I'm thinking of PMQs, Prime Minister's questions. That'll be the thing that, if you watch any Parliament TV or coverage for the UK Parliament, that's what you're likely to see. And depressingly, it's because that kind of combative or amusing take on events, in this case with Pete, he's kind of framing it in this way. That's what the media love to see, don't they? They love to see people arguing and fighting with each other and using bad words and kind of the rough and tumble of politics. And often I think that it means that policy and policy making and nuanced discussion and negotiation, they kind of fall by the wayside in terms of what the media covers. And so I think the public gets quite a skewed impression of what actually goes on. And believe it or not, I know for a fact that people do at Westminster, even at Westminster, work quite well together when it comes to specific issues that you know, all the different parts of the UK can benefit from or be affected by. But it's completely understandable. And I think I can see why Pete Wishart has done this, because it does make a very good point. You can see how reluctantly the Conservative response was dragged out of him. So, yeah, it says a lot.
It was certainly a very different approach from Pete Wishart this afternoon. Although, and to be fair, it certainly struck me that there were a number of very good speeches made from the SNP benches this afternoon. Most of the senior MPs for the SNP made a contribution to the debate, and some of the many of the contributions were absolutely excellent. So watching back on Parliament TV is recommended if people are interested in the debate this afternoon. However, that's our final item for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there, and you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and enjoy our programme again tomorrow night. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest, Serena Cowdy. Thanks, Serena.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. There is one final thing though. Just before we came on air, we learned that the First Minister has asked Elena Whitham MSP to join the Scottish Government as Minister for Community Safety. The First Minister said, "I'm confident Elena's professional and personal experience will stand her in good stead for this role, and I look forward to working with her to improve the safety of communities across the country." We share the First Minister's confidence and wish Elena the very best in her new role. Meantime, please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.